Close your eyes and drift back through the mist of time to a world without supermarkets, without stoves, without even the word calories. A world where survival meant rising with the sun and eating what the earth would give if it gave anything at all. Tonight, we walk quietly beside the forgotten, the hungry, and the humble, and discover what truly kept medieval people alive. In the early morning mist of a nameless medieval village, long before the bells of any church stirred the air, a thin thread of smoke curled from the thatched roof of a humble wattle and daub cottage. It rose lazily into the gray sky, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and faint traces of boiled grains. Inside that cottage, the world was still wrapped in quiet, save for the gentle crackle of the hearth and the slow, deliberate breathing of a woman kneeling by it. Her name was Aldreda, not a name etched in any history book, nor one spoken beyond the edge of her village, but like countless others across the medieval world, her life was defined not by conquest or courtly tales, but by the daily challenge of filling an empty stomach with whatever the land or her hands could provide. Aldreda stirred the bubbling pot slowly. Within it simmered a humble pottage, a staple meal made from barley, a few cabbage leaves, and the remnants of dried peas saved from the previous season. No spices, no meat. The flavor came from the long hours over fire and the memory of better days. Her children, two small figures still curled under woolen blankets stuffed with straw, would soon wake, their first words likely a whisper of hunger. It was always the same. This was not the hunger of modern inconvenience. It was the sort that hummed constantly under the skin, that dulled the mind but never vanished. Food in Aldreda's world was not about preference or pleasure. It was about survival and the ingenuity required to make each day bearable on what little they had. Most days began like this. In the dark stillness before dawn, she would scrape the inside of their storage pot, check for signs of spoilage in the barley sack, and scan the walls for signs of damp that might ruin what little grain they kept. Mold was an enemy, so was rot. The entire year's survival often depended on how well the last harvest had been preserved. And when that failed, when weevils got to the grain or the cabbage soured too soon, the family would turn to the woods. Out there, among brambles and gnarled roots, grew the things no one planted: nettles, sorrel, chickweed, dandelion. Aldreda knew each leaf by sight and smell, taught by her own mother under the same trees. These were not delicacies, they were desperation's gift. She knew when the buds were too bitter to chew, and when a stem could poison rather than nourish. It was knowledge passed down not in books, but in aching bellies and watchful eyes. As the fire popped, she ladled the pottage into wooden bowls. Thin, mismatched things passed through generations. The children stirred at the scent, sat up without a word, and accepted their share with hands still stiff from the chill. There was no blessing, no ceremony, only a glance between them, a silent acknowledgement of another morning met with food, however little it might be. Across the village, similar scenes played out in similar huts. The Lord's Hall might have had salted pork or cheese from the manor dairy, but for the peasants, meals rarely strayed far from gruel and broth. Bread, when it was available, was a precious thing, coarse, dark, and speckled with bits of ground rye or acorn flour. The village oven only baked on certain days, and only when there was enough fuel or grain to make it worth the effort. Aldreda remembered the time her husband had once traded labor for a round of soft, white bread from the manor. They had saved it for days before finally tearing into it on a festival morning. The memory still warmed her more than the hearth. That husband, Wulfric, now worked in the fields beyond the forest edge. In the freezing wind of early spring, with the soil still heavy from melted frost, he and other men of the village bent their backs to the plow. They had little say in the crop. Barley was the safest bet. Oats followed. Wheat was rarer, more vulnerable to blight, and too valuable for commoners to rely upon. Much of what they grew belonged to the Lord anyway. Their lives were measured in the portion left behind, and so they turned to the edges, to gleaning and foraging, to drying wild mushrooms on strings in summer, to fermenting vegetables in clay pots buried near the hearth, and to trapping birds, or catching eels in woven baskets when the streams weren't frozen. Nothing was wasted. The bones of a rabbit became broth. The marrow was scraped. Even the peels of onions, when they had onions at all, might be boiled again. Aldreda once boiled a shoe. Just once. Years ago, when the snow had come early, and the grain bins had been raided. It had tasted of leather and smoke, but it had kept her son alive. The seasons shaped their meals like a drumbeat. In spring, the hunger was sharpest. The stores were low, the new growth not yet ready. Summer brought greens, berries, and the sweet promise of ripening barley. Autumn was a frantic flurry of harvest and drying, smoking, storing. Winter was the reckoning, when each bite had to be measured against the weeks left until the thaw. Festivals were rare exceptions. The church marked them with candles and prayers, and if the harvest had been kind, there might be roast goose or a shared wheel of cheese, even mead fermented from honey gathered in the forest. But such luxuries were fleeting. The everyday meal returned quickly to its quiet, earthy roots. Once, Aldreda had known a traveling monk who passed through the village. He had told her of faraway places where oranges grew, where spices came in barrels, and where people poured honey over their bread. She had laughed, not out of disbelief, but out of disbelief that any such thing would ever matter in her life. To her, food was not about desire. It was about getting through another day with strength enough to carry water, to mend clothes, to grind grain by hand for hours until her shoulders ached. On better days, the villagers gathered to share what little they had. Communal pottage might stretch farther with every spoon dipped from the pot. Children played while elders told stories around the fire, their bellies warmed not by abundance, but by company. There was dignity in the sharing, even when hunger sat quietly behind every word. Still, disease often crept in faster than hunger. Malnutrition made it easier for fevers to settle in, for wounds to fester, for coughs to turn deadly. Aldreda had buried one child already, lost to a chill that turned to something worse. No priest could save him, no herb, no boiled root. She had offered up every crumb of their food in those days, praying that strength might return to his limbs. But some winters had no mercy. Now, she watched her surviving too carefully, ensuring they never went a day without at least one meal. Even if it meant she went without, the sun had risen fully now, and Wulfric would return soon, soaked in earth and sweat, fingers blistered from the plow's wooden shaft. She would offer him the last bit of pottage, perhaps slice a radish thinly to place on top. Make it seem like something special. He would smile tiredly, accept it, and they would sit in the quiet glow of the hearth, chewing slowly, knowing it had to last. And so the days passed, one meal into the next, tied not to feasts or banquets, but to the deep, quiet endurance of a people who asked little and survived on less. Their world was held together not by grand gestures, but by pots of pottage and loaves of black bread, by shared bowls and silent gratitude. Their meals were cheap, but their hunger shaped history more than any crown. Later that same day, As the village settled into the stillness of early evening, the low sun cast long shadows across the beaten paths that wound through thatched cottages and open yards. Smoke drifted lazily from hearth chimneys, and the scent of boiled herbs and root vegetables hung in the cooling air. Aldreda sat by the doorway of her small home, mending a worn woolen sleeve with a bone needle, her fingers moving with a steadiness that came from years of repetition rather than any luxury of time. Her eldest, Oswin, was crouched nearby, poking a stick into the dirt and murmuring a song he barely remembered the words to. Her youngest, a girl named Lean, lay curled in a blanket by the fire, worn out from gathering firewood earlier in the day. They had eaten the last of the pottage at midday, the broth thin further than usual, stretched with a handful of crushed acorns and a single shriveled parsnip that had somehow evaded rot. Tomorrow, Dreda would need to walk to the forest again. She had marked a patch of wild garlic growing under the shade of old oaks, sharp in flavor, but enough to bring life to boiled lentils, if she could find any in the village to trade for. Even garlic alone, steeped in warm water, could feel like a feast if one hadn't tasted meat in months. In the distance, she could hear the voices of other women calling their children, herding them inside before the damp cold settled in. Chickens clucked from the coops. A stray dog padded along the fence line, nose close to the ground. The sounds were familiar, soothing in their sameness. Life was thin, but it moved steadily forward, tied to rhythms as old as the soil. Wulfric's footsteps soon approached the sound of heavy boots dragging through dry straw and dirt. He stepped into the cottage with the smell of earth still clinging to his tunic, shoulders slumped, and hands blistered from the weight of the plow. He offered Aldreda a tired smile and crouched beside the fire. She passed him a cloth bundle of nettle leaves she'd scalded earlier. He chewed them without a word, grateful even for that bitter bite. "I saw Toastig today," he murmured. "Said the Reeve will be collecting grain earlier this year. Once the tithe before the midsummer sun." Dreda frowned, tucking away her needle. "We've only just sown what we had. He doesn't care. The manor's granary comes before ours." They sat in silence after that, letting the fire crackle between them. This was not news. It was just another reminder that their place in the world was fixed. Their labor always claimed first for the benefit of others. Outside, the last light faded into a pale blue twilight. In the past, Aldreda remembered how her father used to light a single beeswax candle on nights like this. He had traded for it during one of the village fairs, a rare treat. The scent of honey had lingered in their hut for hours, a smell she associated now with comfort. They didn't have beeswax anymore, just a twisted length of reed dipped in tallow, which sputtered and smoked, but offered enough light to see by. She lit it slowly, shielding the flame with her hand, until it steadied. Lean stirred and looked up with half-closed eyes, her cheek warm from the fire. Aldreda stroked her hair and then rose to prepare what she could for the next day. She checked the sacks, barely a handful of barley left, a few dried beans, too hard to bite even when boiled, some dried apple slices, leathery but still sweet, enough perhaps to carry them one more day. Tomorrow, she'd take Lean and Oswin to the edges of the woods. With Wulfric in the fields and no one left to watch them, they would follow her on careful feet. She would show them the spring herbs, the young sorrel, the fat buds of goosefoot, the fresh growth of watercress in the shallows. It was not just food. It was the knowledge they'd need, should they survive long enough to use it on their own. There was no school, no books, but there was memory. And Aldreda carried hers like a map written across every season. She remembered when her mother had made syrup from birch bark, boiled down to thick sweetness in a clay pot. It had taken all day, but it had made their winter bread taste like something worth chewing. She remembered, too, the bitter broth made from pine needles, strange but full of something that kept their teeth from loosening. She would pass these memories to her children, one meal at a time. The fire dimmed, the wind picked up, and the village faded into stillness again. Night was cold, but not bitter. Aldreda curled up near the hearth, pulling a blanket over Lean and pressing Oswin close. She closed her eyes, not to dream, but to rest the body that would have to rise again with the sun and start the search anew. Hunger never ended. It only paused, and in the pause, life lingered quietly. Morning returned with a thin mist draped across the village, softening every sound and blurring the edges of rooftops and trees. The air smelled of damp wood, soil, and the lingering traces of ash. Aldreda woke before the children stirred, her body stiff from the hard floor, and her limbs heavy with fatigue that never truly lifted. She sat up slowly, listening first to the sounds of the world outside, the cluck of hens, the creak of distant carts, the bark of a dog echoing from beyond the village edge. Life had begun again quietly, without ceremony. The hearth had gone cold overnight. She crouched before it, coaxing a new flame from the embers with the same care she might offer a newborn. A little dried moss, some splinters from the woodpile, and a breath held just long enough. When the fire caught, it crackled to life with a satisfying warmth that began to spread through the room. Aldreda leaned in, holding her hands close, then turned her attention to the morning's meal. What little barley they had left she poured into a bowl and added water from the clay jug near the door. The water had a chill to it drawn the day before from the stream that ran beyond the copse of trees. It was always cold in the early months, its surface like glass in the morning. She stirred the grains slowly, knowing there would be no time to grind them into flour. Instead, she boiled them as they were, coarse and whole, with the pinch of dried mint she'd tied into a bundle last summer. It added a faint sharpness to the taste, like a whisper of something better. Oswin and Lean stirred under their shared blanket, their eyes blinking against the light of the fire. Neither spoke. They knew by the look on their mother's face what kind of morning it would be. When Wulfric left earlier to help repair the fencing around the manor's pasture, he had taken with him nothing but a strip of hard bread tucked into a cloth. He'd return late, tired, with hands scratched and sore, perhaps with news of a small reward, a wedge of soft cheese if he was lucky. The luck was rare this time of year. Aldreda passed the bowls to the children and sat beside them as they ate. It was not a meal to savor, only to consume. The barley was firm, the mint barely noticeable, but it was warm, and it filled the space inside that had begun to ache. Lean offered her last bite to her brother without a word. He took it, hesitated, and then split it back between them. There were no lessons in generosity, only instinct, shaped by shared hunger. With their meal finished, Aldreda bundled Lean in a shawl and handed Oswin the small basket. It was time to gather. The woods would not wait, and neither would their needs. She tied a strip of cloth around her waist to carry what wouldn't fit in the basket, tucked a small knife into her belt, and stepped out into the mist. The path to the forest was worn from generations of footsteps, not the main road used by carts and traders, but a narrow trail that slipped between hedgerows and skirted the edge of a field thick with dew. Birds flitted between branches overhead, and the earth smelled rich, almost sweet, in the way spring soil often did. There was life beneath the surface, even if it had yet to show itself fully. They walked quietly, ears tuned to the sound of movement, rabbits perhaps, or the low rustle of hedgehogs stirring in the undergrowth. Aldrete pointed out the early shoots of wild sorrel, its heart-shaped leaves tender and tart. She plucked a few, handing some to the children to chew. It wasn't a meal, but it was something. A few yards further, she found nettles. Wearing a strip of wool around her hand, she bent the stalks and pinched off the tips, young, green, and perfect for boiling into a thick, mineral-rich broth. Oswin spotted wild chives near a flat stone, and grinned. Aldrete nodded approvingly, running her fingers over the slender green blades before cutting them close to the soil. The scent that rose was sharp and clean, promising something more than bland porridge when added to their pot. She had learned, long ago, that smell was the first gift of food. Even if the taste disappointed, the promise of it could lift a spirit. In a patch of shade, she uncovered ground ivy and a few violets, edible and soft. She took what she could, careful not to strip the patch bare. She never gathered everything, never more than the forest could afford to lose. These plants were not hers, they belonged to the land and to the season. She was only borrowing. As the basket filled, she found her thoughts wandering back to the old days, before the last harsh winter, when they had a hen who laid regularly, when eggs were boiled with greens and mashed into a kind of paste for supper. It had felt indulgent then, like something more than survival. The hen had died in the frost, and no one had spoken of getting another. Too costly, too difficult. She wondered what had become of its feathers, probably stuffed into the sleeves of Lean's winter shift, now worn and thin. By midday, the mist had lifted, and the sun hung like a pale coin above the treetops. They sat on a moss-covered log and shared the last slice of dried apple, chewing it in silence. Oswin leaned his head against her arm, and Lean picked at the laces of her shoes. Their faces were thin, but alert. They were learning, whether they realized it or not. They returned to the village slowly, arms full, bellies quiet but minds focused. The basket held a modest bounty, enough for a broth, enough to stretch a few meals. In a small cloth pouch, Aldrete carried a bit of ash salt gifted by the old widow 3 huts down. It would season their food with just enough sharpness to mask the blandness. She had traded a sprig of thyme for it, one of the few herbs she grew in a cracked clay pot near the cottage window. Back home, she cleaned the greens, sorted them by type, and placed the nettles into the pot first. She boiled them with a single dried onion and a few grains of barley, then added the chives and wild garlic near the end. The broth turned a dark, murky green, but the smell was rich. Oswin peeked in, his mouth twitching in approval. Lean fetched the bowls and laid them out carefully. This meal, though still simple, tasted different. Not sweet, not savory, but something alive. It held the memory of soil, the freshness of wild air, and the faint illusion of fullness. As they ate, Wulfric returned, his hands dirty and his back hunched. He said little, but his eyes softened as he tasted the broth. He looked at Aldrete and nodded once, a silent thank you for her work, her watchfulness, her endless effort. That night, after the bowls were cleaned and the fire banked low, Aldrete sat by the hearth and closed her eyes. She could still smell the nettles on her hands, still taste the chives in the broth. It had not been a feast, but it had been enough. Enough to stretch one more day, enough to keep her children upright, enough to let her husband rest. In the medieval world, cheap meals weren't born from thrift or choice. They were born from the earth, from the resilience of women like Aldrete, and from the unspoken knowledge passed down by countless generations how to find, stretch, and honor every edible thing the world had to offer. Hunger was their constant companion, but so too was endurance, And in that quiet space between desperation and resolve, life continued. Always, the days that followed blended into one another, marked not by events, but by the subtle rhythm of survival. Aldreda rose with the same stiffness in her bones, the same cautious hope that what little they had might carry them through. Outside, the trees were thickening with new leaves, the birds louder in their songs, and the earth warming enough that the children ran barefoot in the yard again. It was spring in name, but not yet in plenty. The first shoots had come, but the true harvest lay far ahead, and until then, meals remained a patchwork of forage, trade, and memory. On one such morning, as the sky cracked open to soft light, Aldreda heard the knock at the door, 3 soft taps followed by silence. It was Ethelwyn, the widow from the other side of the village, holding a bundle wrapped in worn linen. She stepped inside with the quiet assurance of someone who had known this threshold many times before. "I have something," she said softly, unwrapping the cloth. Inside were several small root vegetables, turnips mostly, along with a misshapen carrot and 2 sprigs of thyme tied with flaxstring. "Found them buried deep in my bin. Thought they might still boil well enough." Aldreda smiled and stepped aside. "I've chive broth left over. Come sit. We'll make something of it." They didn't speak much as they worked. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, and adding pinch after pinch of dried herbs spoke enough. The fire crackled with satisfaction, and the broth began to turn thicker, heartier. The smell filled the cottage, earthy and sharp, something that made the children sit up and peer over their bowls before they were even served. Ethelwyn handed Lean a small square of flaxcloth with a few berries inside. "Dried last summer," she explained, "hidden in my sewing kit. Almost forgot them." Lean's eyes widened as if she'd been handed a treasure from a foreign land. She took the berries with the kind of reverence only a child could muster and placed them carefully on the wooden table, not yet ready to eat them. When the stew was ready, they all sat together. The flavor was simple root and herb, softened by time over fire, but it was real, and it was warm, and it filled their bellies with something beyond mere necessity. Ethelwyn recounted a tale from her girlhood as they ate, of a time when the village had once trapped a wild boar that wandered too close, and how the meat had fed nearly everyone for 3 days. Aldreda listened with half a smile, imagining the unlikely event as though it were a fairy tale. "Those were good days," Ethelwyn said finally, brushing crumbs from her apron. "But you don't know they're good until they've gone." After she left, Aldreda sat alone by the fire for a time, watching the flame dance low behind the iron pot. Her thoughts drifted again not to kings or wars or the doings of the manor, but to how many women like her, in how many cottages across the land, were boiling the same nettles, chopping the same turnips, bending over the same firelight with hope tucked silently into every bowl. That afternoon, Wulfric returned with a quiet urgency in his step. He brought with him a clay jar sealed with wax. "From the beekeeper's apprentice," he said, eyes bright. "A thank you for the thatching repair. Said it's only scraps from the combs, but there's honey at the bottom." Aldreda held the jar like it might break under its own importance. Honey, not a syrup or a boiled sweet root imitation, but real honey. She opened it slowly, and the golden scent rose like incense. Oswin leaned over it, mouth parted in awe. Even Lean reached for it with uncharacteristic boldness. That night, they dipped dried bread into the jar, just a bit for each. The sweetness made the children laugh. Wulfric sat quietly, eyes closed for a moment as if trying to trap the taste in memory. Aldreda let the drop melt on her tongue. It was sharp, deep, and warm like summer had visited their cottage early. She thought of the bees then, their tireless work, their slow crafting of sweetness from flower to hive. There was a lesson in it, perhaps, that from the smallest things petals, sun, rain came something golden, something sustaining. She tucked the jar away safely after, every remaining drop worth its weight in silver. The following days brought rain, soft and persistent. The air grew damp and chill again, and the cottage walls darkened with moisture. Foraging became harder. The woods were slick and muddy, and the young shoots were delicate, easily bruised. Aldretta began drying nettle leaves on a rope stretched near the hearth, threading them with the needle and hanging them like green coins. In time, they'd turn brittle and would last into the harder months, when even the trees held nothing. She mixed acorn meal with boiled grains one evening to make small cakes flat, bitter, and best eaten hot. The acorns had been soaked for days, their tannins leached away slowly with stream water. She remembered her mother teaching her the process. Change the water often, never boil too soon, or the bitterness would never leave. Lean, who had never liked the taste, gnawed on her cake in silence, and then tucked it into the sleeve of her shift when she thought no one was watching. Aldretta said nothing. Sometimes a small act of rebellion was its own kind of nourishment. Word came from the reeve one morning. A collection was due. Not just grain this time, but anything edible, herbs, dried roots, even preserved mushrooms. The Lord's Hall was preparing for guests, and every cottage was expected to contribute. The village murmured with resentment, but no one refused. To do so was to risk more than hunger. Aldretta gave half her thyme, a bundle of dried garlic, and the last of the fermented cabbage she'd stored in a clay pot. It hurt to hand it over. The cabbage had taken weeks to cure properly. Its briny scent a signal of good preservation. It had been her winter's pride, but she wrapped it in cloth and gave it with a quiet nod. In return, the Reeves boy slipped her a small pouch of smoked fish, coarse, dry, but real, likely from the manor's pond. She divided it carefully that evening, boiling it with barley and adding wild mustard greens. The broth turned rich and aromatic, the fish falling apart in delicate flakes. Even the smell lifted their mood, spreading through the cottage like a memory of feast days. As they ate, the rain lessened, the wind eased, and the sky outside turned the soft blue of late dusk. Oswin began humming a tune from the festival to summers past. Lean joined in, her voice thin but cheerful. Wulfric chuckled softly, tapping his bowl with a rhythm. Aldretta listened, her heart full and quiet. They had enough. Not plenty, never plenty, but enough. Outside, the woods continued to grow, the earth still damp with promise. The days ahead would bring their own burdens, more hunger, more searching, but for now, in this small cottage lit by the fading fire, there was warmth, and food, and the faint, flickering taste of peace. As spring ripened and the days lengthened, the village began to breathe a little easier. The soil grew softer underfoot, the winds less biting. The bare branches of winter were now thick with leaves, and the fields, once gray with frost and emptiness, shimmered green under the sun. Aldretta walked barefoot more often now, feeling the earth beneath her toes as she moved between cottage, stream, and forest edge. There was something reassuring about the rhythm returning to the land, like a long-held breath finally released. She had begun trading again, now with more confidence. A woman named Frida, who kept a goat, needed help with weaving, and in exchange offered a small amount of curdled milk each week. It came in a linen-wrapped pouch, sour and thick, with the sharpness that made even boiled lentils feel indulgent. On some days, Aldretta would mix it with ground mustard seed or the brine of pickled greens to stretch its flavor even further. The Children learned to savor every spoonful, rolling it across their tongues before swallowing, knowing it would be gone too quickly. With the return of growth came new kinds of labor. The village men dug trenches to drain the lower fields, while the women gathered herbs in larger baskets, drying bunches of yarrow, mint, and mugwort on long wooden racks. The air inside each home turned fragrant, thick with the scent of summer, before it had truly begun. Even the manor seemed more at ease. Its servants seemed more often at the market stall or moving through the village lanes without the usual urgency in their step. Aldretta's own days were filled with foraging, cleaning, boiling, and bartering. Her hands were never idle. She worked strips of old linen into bandages soaked in garlic and vinegar, taught Oswin how to identify edible mushrooms without mistake, and let Lean carry the kindling basket to heavy for her in winter, but now manageable under gentler skies. One morning she rose before dawn, drawn outside by a strange stillness. The village lay quiet in the pale blue hush of early morning, not a soul moving yet. A soft mist clung to the rooftops, and dew glittered on the grass. She stepped outside with bare feet and walked slowly toward the communal garden patch where villagers sometimes grew shared vegetables, mostly leeks, beans, and brassica. The garden had been planted weeks before, but now the shoots were rising with purpose, rows of green against the black soil. She bent down and ran a hand across the leaves, checking for signs of slugs, pulling a few weeds with care. Even this small patch, no larger than a smithy's floor, could make the difference between surviving the hunger weeks or not. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find an old man named Rodger, half blind, stooped, but with a voice like old leather. He greeted her with a grunt and pointed to a part of the patch she'd missed. They worked side by side in silence, the only sound being the whisper of pulled weeds and the chirp of morning birds. When they were done, he handed her 2 hens, eggs from the pocket of his cloak. "They're warm still," he muttered. "Took them just before coming out." Aldretta looked at him in surprise. Eggs were rare enough to be counted one by one, usually reserved for barter or the sick. "You sure?" He nodded. "I'll take a bit of that vinegar you made, the good one, with the berry husks in it." They made the exchange on the spot. When she returned to her cottage, the children were still curled up in sleep, their faces calm for once. She placed the eggs gently into a small clay dish near the hearth and set water to boil. She would make porridge with the dried oats she'd been saving, mash in the eggs slowly for texture, and add a spoonful of goat's curd if it hadn't gone sour. A meal fit for a feast, at least by their measures. She did not tell the children what was coming. Better to let them taste it without expectation. When they sat with their bowls, their eyes widened, then narrowed with disbelief. "It's soft," Lean whispered, "like the food the Reeves' daughter had." Oswin took a second bite and didn't speak for several minutes. The rest of the day passed gently. The children played in the yard with reeds and carved bits of wood, fashioning boats to float in the shallow stream. Aldretta repaired a pair of worn shoes, her fingers stiff from the stitching, but warmed by the memory of breakfast. Wulfric returned early, uninjured and almost cheerful. He had mended one of the manor gates and been given a hunk of hard cheese wrapped in waxed cloth. It smelled sharp and tasted like salt and dust, but it was cheese, and that was enough. That night, they sat together outside the cottage. The air was cool but not cold, and the stars above blinked faintly between the thinning clouds. They shared the last of the cheese, paired with rough bread she'd baked on a flat stone over the fire. The bread was coarse and gritty, made with barley flour and acorn meal, but when paired with the cheese, it took on a new life. Even Wulfric laughed softly as he chewed. "I remember when I was small," he said, "and my mother made a stew from turnips, dried meat, and onions. She let it sit overnight, and in the morning it was thick as paste. We thought it was the finest thing we'd ever eaten." "Was it?" Aldreda asked, smiling. He shrugged. "It was warm. That's all I remember. The children lay on a blanket nearby, pointing at constellations they only half remembered the names of." Lean whispered stories to herself somewhere between fact and imagination about stars that dropped fish into the rivers when people were kind, and of trees that bore bread loaves in the spring if you spoke to them gently. Aldreda listened without correcting her. In a world that so often asked them to accept hunger, let her daughter imagine generosity from the stars. Before bed, Aldreda checked their stores. There was still some goat curd, a bit of barley, and a handful of dried herbs. Not plenty, but enough. The next morning would bring new needs, more labor, and another search for what could be eaten. But for now, her family was fed, warm, and quiet. And in that quiet, she found something close to peace. Cheap meals had never meant simple meals. Each one held the weight of effort, the memory of hardship, the careful balance of risk and need. Every broth, every crust, every bowl of forage green was a testament not just to survival, but to the quiet strength of those who made something from almost nothing. As the days passed into months, and the years turned with little change to the burdens of survival, people learned not only how to live with less, but how to see sustenance in the ordinary. In the corners of every thatched home, in the creaking wooden cupboards or the cool dark of earthen cellars, there existed humble ingredients, not glamorous, not exotic, but enduring. It was here, in these overlooked corners of daily life, that the meals of the poor were quietly crafted with care, shaped by habit and hardship alike. Peasants, bound to the rhythms of the land, had long since mastered the slow, deliberate process of fermenting what little grain they had. Rye and barley, more resistant to poor soil and harsh weather than wheat, were the cornerstones of their diet. Grains were stored in cloth sacks, hung from the ceiling beams to avoid moisture and rats. From them came coarse breads and pottages, slow-cooked stews of grain and water, thickened with whatever vegetables remained from the harvest. It was a patience-based cuisine, shaped by scarcity where time was the most abundant ingredient. Pottage might simmer all day over a low fire, the flavors deepening slowly, aided by wild herbs foraged earlier in the year and dried on strings hung beside the hearth. Thyme, sage, and marjoram were not used lavishly, but measured out carefully, crushed between fingers and dropped into the bubbling pot with reverence, as though each leaf held a memory of sunlit fields. Families would pass around bowls made of wood, often with the edges worn smooth by generations of hands. The pottage varied day by day, sometimes gruel-like with barley, sometimes slightly sweet if turnips or carrots were added. On rare days, a bit of bacon rind or lard might find its way into the pot, a treasured addition that would perfume the entire room and lift spirits for hours. And then there were the thick porridges, ladled out at dawn and dusk, cooked in large pots and stirred with wooden paddles. These porridges became the foundation of life, not just breakfast, but also dinner. They were made from millet, oats, or spelt, and seasoned with salt, if available, or mixed with boiled greens for texture. In some households, dried apple peel or crab apples might be shredded into the mix, giving a tangy sharpness to an otherwise bland spoonful. For children, especially in colder months, meals became acts of quiet endurance. The bread was sliced thin and eaten with ale or watered-down milk. Ale, not yet the bitter brew we know today, was a mild drink low in alcohol, higher in calories, and safer than much of the water available. Even the youngest learned to drink it with meals, their small wooden cups filled beside their parents' larger ones, when times were slightly better, or when a festival or saint's day approached. Families would gather what they could to prepare more festive dishes, not rich or indulgent, but heartier, sometimes even sweet. Honey, the only available sweetener for much of the medieval period, was a luxury, but if a neighbor kept bees or if the village had a skilled beekeeper, a spoonful of honey might find its way into porridge or bread dough. The result was a rare delight. Warm honey cakes, dense and sticky, eaten slowly and shared evenly. Preserved fruits were another joy of the season, if they existed. Plums dried into leathery strips, apples hung by their stems until they puckered, and elderberries fermented into thin, sour syrups. All were treasured in the depths of winter. They were eaten with fingers, no ceremony, only gratitude. In some communities, communal ovens offered an opportunity to bake more elaborate meals. Women would bring their doughs wrapped in cloth, carrying them through muddy lanes to the central oven. There, beneath a roof of soot-stained beams, the loaves were placed side by side. Each woman marked her loaf with a unique cut or symbol, so they could be claimed once baked. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the village streets, comforting and familiar, reminding all that however poor the ingredients, the act of baking remained an art of love and necessity. Children, barefoot even in the cool air, would sometimes gather wild herbs like sorrel or watercress from nearby streams. These green bundles were rinsed and chopped into stews or laid across bread for a burst of freshness. Older children learned to fish, casting simple nets or lines into slow rivers or village ponds, hoping to catch something, even a small perch, to supplement the family meal. When meat was not an option, and it often wasn't, people turned to legumes. Lentils, peas, and broad beans were cooked slowly into thick, pasty stews. These pulses, dried in summer and stored in clay jars, were reliable, filling, and provided protein when meat could not. With onions or garlic added, both grown in small kitchen gardens, the dishes took on a warming, familiar flavor, and through it all, the act of eating remained a shared ritual. Meals were not taken alone. Family members, farmhands, and sometimes neighbors gathered close, especially when the winds blew hard and cold against their wooden homes. They spoke little as they ate, not because there was nothing to say, but because the food itself was sacred in its own way, a reminder of their labor, their resilience, and their connection to one another. Even in such simplicity, there was rhythm, variety, and deep tradition. No meal was too small to matter. Every scrap was saved, every crust softened and used again, and every bit of warmth drawn from these humble foods carried them one step further through the year. The taste of barley and the scent of dried thyme became the very texture of life, and as the firelight flickered across dirt floors and smoky ceilings, the stories of old meals, great winters, and lean years before were told again, not just to remember, but to pass on the wisdom of eating with care, of surviving with less, and of honoring the quiet dignity of the poor man's plate. In the shadowy corners of a crumbling manor house in northern France, where the winds howled louder than the hearth ever roared, a family of tenant farmers huddled over a pot suspended above a flickering flame. This was not the grand meal of kings nor the feast of noble lords. It was pottage, the very essence of survival, simmering with chopped wild garlic, wilted cabbage leaves, and the few turnips they could coax from the frozen earth. Day after day, year after year, These simple stews were the difference between life and death, their monotony only broken by the rare addition of marrow bones, scavenged from the local butcher's refuse pile. But there was something else simmering in that pot, not just roots and herbs, but the shared memory of hardship. In villages all across medieval Europe, families leaned on these basic foods not just to fill bellies, but to carry stories. Each child fed from that ladle would grow up knowing hunger, yes, but also resilience, and the soft patience that only those who have boiled cabbage 12 ways can understand. In the south, near the dust-washed fields of Castile, dried lentils and fava beans were the lifeblood of the peasantry, soaked overnight and cooked slowly in clay pots nestled in embers. These legumes provided the rare warmth of protein. A splash of vinegar, if one was lucky, added flavor. But what lent the real taste was tradition, recipes passed down from mother to daughter, father to son, all spoken from memory, murmured like old prayers as the pot stirred. And so, hunger became a teacher, and meals, though sparse, became moments of togetherness. Near the coast, where sea winds salted the air, things were only slightly different. The ocean gave no certainty, but sometimes it gave mollusks, cockles, limpets, even tiny clams pried from the rocks at low tide. These were boiled in seawater and added to gruel made from barley flour, a practice passed down by fisher folk too poor for sails. They called it stone stew, a joke, of course, because sometimes all you had left were the stones you cooked it in. But laughter, too, was a kind of meal, and for those scraping life from tidal pools, it fed the soul when the belly could not. In the monasteries, where silence ruled and wealth was unevenly distributed, the fare was not as poor, but it remained humble. Bread made from rye or oats was dunked in thin onion soup, taken slowly, one spoon at a time. The monks grew herbs in cloistered gardens, thyme, sage, and lovage, used not to impress, but to stretch meager ingredients into something vaguely comforting. Fridays, of course, meant fish, and not always the fresh kind. Dried cod was rehydrated over hours and shredded into the same stews the peasants ate. In those moments, the walls between the sacred and the starving felt surprisingly thin. Even nobles, for all their banquets and wines, had moments of humility, though theirs often came during war or siege. When castles ran low on stores, kitchens turned to the same peasant tricks: dried peas, salted meat, pickled turnips. Without servants or spice, without sugar or status, they too tasted what the poor had long known, that hunger made even boiled roots seem like treasure. That chewing stale bread slowly, dipped in broth, was sometimes the most honest way to eat. Meanwhile, in the east, in the muddy, frozen lands of Poland and Lithuania, entire communities thrived on thick, sour rye porridge, served with nothing more than browned onions and cabbage. Pickling was essential here. Cucumbers, beets, even apples were submerged in brine jars for the winter months. These ferments became the flavors of survival: sour, sharp, and strong enough to cut through frostbite. Children learned early to press cabbage into barrels, to salt it just right, to pack it tight under heavy stones. These were not just chores, they were rites, anchors in a world where the next meal was always uncertain. As travelers moved from village to village, region to region, they noticed how different ingredients told the same story. The Scottish crofter, tending his oats near the moors, made porridge as his father had, thickened with goat's milk, if there was any, and sweetened with a spoonful of honey only on feast days. In the Alps, shepherds dried curds from sheep's milk and grated them into barley broth. In the lowlands of Holland, Bread was soaked in beer and mashed with carrots and odd, thick meal, but hearty enough to work the land on. By now, one thing became abundantly clear: the medieval poor were masters of making do. They didn't just eat to live. They wove meaning into meals, learned to transform scraps into comfort, and honored every morsel as though it might be the last. This wasn't just cooking, it was remembering, it was resisting, it was carrying the quiet knowledge of the hungry forward through generations. In the winding streets of a small English market town, the scent of wood smoke clung to the air, blending with the soreness of yeast and yesterday's cabbage. Each morning, long before the bells rang or carts creaked over cobblestones, the town's women gathered near communal ovens, their rough fingers pressing loaves of rye into shape, dusted with coarse flour and left to rise beneath cloths damp with breath. Bread was everything: sustenance, currency, and sometimes offering. The rich had white bread from bolted wheat flour, soft and light like clouds. But the poor, as always, made do. Their loaves were heavy and dark, made from rye, barley, or a gritty mix known as maslin, a blend of what they could afford and what survived the weather. Bread was never wasted. Even the hardest crusts, too stale to chew, were soaked in broth, beer, or milk, and eaten slowly, as if each bite might lead to another day. In many homes, trenchers' old, thick slices of bread were used as plates. After a stew or meat had been ladled on and eaten, the bread was either consumed or given to beggars, soft with gravy and fat, rich beyond its original form. These soggy slabs were prized by the desperate. To a child who hadn't seen meat in months, a trencher soaked in lard was a miracle. In the villages, meals were often communal, especially among the poorest. Entire households would gather around a single pot, and the evening stew was shared with the same reverence as a sacred ritual. The pot might contain leeks, watercress, nettles, or the last wrinkled carrot from storage. If a hen had died, a few shreds of meat might flavor the broth. But more often, the meat was only a memory. Instead, flavor came from smoky onions, wild herbs, and the earthiness of root vegetables. Children learned to forage early. In the hedgerows and forest edges, they picked sorrel, chickweed, and goosefoot, so-called weeds that were anything but. These greens were chopped into stews or boiled alone and eaten with bread. Some families made pancakes from flour mixed with foraged greens and fried them over stones heated in the hearth. Others ground acorns into meal, soaked to remove the bitterness, and mixed them with oat flour to stretch the dough just a little further. Markets were filled with noise and barter, not coins. Peasants who had no silver traded eggs for cabbage, wool for onions, firewood for a jug of milk. Sometimes they shared what little they had simply because that's how one survived. If a neighbor's child was sick, an extra egg might quietly change hands. If someone's wheat crop had failed, a handful of peas might appear at their doorstep. Generosity was born not of abundance, but of understanding, a shared recognition that hunger was a familiar visitor to them all. In times of hardship, war, famine, or plague, even these small comforts vanished. In those dark seasons, people boiled leather shoes, chewed bark, and ground dried nettles into dust for soup. Some ate straw boiled in broth. Others roasted rats or sparrows when they could catch them. When the famine of 1315 struck, following relentless rains that destroyed crops across Europe, entire families died with empty stomachs. Fields lay drowned, granaries bare, and yet still, in quiet corners, a mother would find a way to make broth. From the last onion skin and a crust of bread, there were other adaptations too. learned through the years. In coastal villages, seaweed became a source of salt and nutrients. In Scandinavian forests, bark was stripped, dried, and ground into flour. In alpine huts, turnip tops were boiled and mashed with goat's milk. From the Italian hills to the Irish plains, the same lesson was learned over and over, that creativity was born of necessity, and survival was rooted in patience, care, and community. Religion played its role as well. The church imposed fasting days, especially during Lent or holy festivals. For the rich, fasting meant no red meat, but plenty of fish, cheese, and sweets. For the poor, it simply meant less fat, less broth, sometimes less bread. On Fridays, and during Lent, many families relied entirely on dried peas, onions, and black bread. Fish, when available, came salted and dried, far from fresh cod and herring being most common. In some towns, fish was ground with breadcrumbs, molded into cakes, and fried in lard. It was the closest they'd come to something resembling luxury. In more fortunate years, when crops were good and the weather kind, the people celebrated with food. Villagers baked pies filled with apples, leeks, and even boiled eggs. Children ran through fields with bits of honeycomb or a rare apple tucked into their hands. During harvest festivals, communal feasts were held, and the poor shared in the bounty. Roasted grains, ale, perhaps a bit of cheese or roasted fowl. These moments were fleeting, but they lived long in memory. A single good harvest could feed stories for years. As the sun set behind ancient trees and the last light flickered through crooked windows, the sounds of the medieval village softened. Porridge simmered quietly in pots, bread cooled on wooden boards, and smoke curled from low chimneys into the dusky sky. And within each home, no matter how humble, someone sat near the fire, cradling a wooden bowl, chewing slowly, gratefully. Because survival was never about abundance. It was about the slow alchemy of turning scraps into sustenance. It was about shared bowls, whispered prayers, and the warmth of a meal made not with wealth, but with care. The medieval world was harsh, but its people were hardy, not because they had much, but because they made everything count. The flickering light of a single tallow candle illuminated the rough wooden walls of the peasant's cottage, casting soft shadows that danced with the breath of the wind, seeping in through the gaps in the boards. In the quiet of the late evening, the family sat close, huddled for warmth, not just from the cold, but from the ache of hunger that so often visited them like an unwelcome spirit. The day's toil had yielded little, and what food they had was measured carefully, divided not by appetite, but by necessity. A crust of rye bread, blackened at the edges, was passed from hand to hand. It was dry, but dipped in the thin onion broth simmering over the hearth. It softened just enough to remind them it was food. No meat adorned the stew, not even a scrap of fat. It was a memory of flavor more than substance. Yet still, they ate. In silence, grateful. The children, their eyes wide and tired, clutched small wooden bowls as if guarding treasure. This was survival, plain, meager, and entirely ordinary. Outside, the village slumbered under a cloak of mist and stars. Somewhere a distant dog barked, then quieted. The fields beyond the low stone walls were bare, resting for the winter, and the larder indoors was no fuller. In lean seasons, families like theirs relied on what could be stored: root vegetables, buried deep in cool cellars, dried pulses traded weeks ago, and the constant blessing and curse of cabbages. Boiled, fermented, or roasted when fuel allowed, cabbages were the ever-present companion of the medieval poor. The smell of cooking often told more of hope than richness. In the monasteries, where some villagers sought alms, monks distributed pottage thick mushes of lentils or peas, seasoned only with salt if they were lucky. On special days, a splash of vinegar or a pinch of wild herbs added a spark to the otherwise dull gray. Some days, the broth was so thin, it seemed little more than flavored water, but even that was welcome. In the manorial estates, the laborers who worked the Lord's land received small allocations of grain as part of their wage. These were boiled into gruels, eaten morning and night. When flour was available, women baked flatbreads over open hearthstones, their scorched scent mingling with smoke and sweat. They fed large families with small amounts stretching every bite, every kernel. Children learned young to forage. In spring and summer, they scoured hedgerows for wild garlic, nettles, and sorrel. In autumn, they searched for mushrooms, cautious not to pick the wrong kind. And in winter, they prayed. Life was not a feast, but a test of endurance. One elderly woman, known as Matilde in her village, was famed for her ability to create meals from nothing. She gathered dandelion greens, boiled acorns to leach their bitterness, and made porridge from ground chestnuts. Her meals never filled the belly completely, but they warmed the spirit. She claimed the trick was not in the ingredients, but in the patience, the long, slow simmering that turned the harshest root into something soft. In towns, apprentices and day laborers often pooled resources to prepare a single pot meal shared among many. These humble gatherings were less about taste and more about communion, human connection, forged over bowls of barley or mashed beans. Laughter still rose in those rooms, echoing between cracked walls, even as hunger never fully left. At tea times, the rich discarded scraps, bones with the sliver of meat, heels of cheese gone hard that beggars or desperate peasants claimed. There was no shame in such salvage, only survival. Some boiled bones for hours to create a broth so thin, nearly disappeared in the steam, yet it carried with it the ghost of nourishment. Famine was no stranger. Failed harvests brought desperate decisions. Some chewed on bark, some made flour from ground fern roots, others traveled, seeking work or mercy from distant lands. Along the roads, wayfarers passed one another with tired eyes, carrying pouches of dried beans or oatcakes hardened into stone. A shared meal on the roadside was a quiet act of kindness, and yet, in the midst of this hardship, there was a rhythm, a stability in the routines of planting and preparing. Feasts were rare, but they came. Holy days, weddings, the rare good year. Then, tables were covered with boiled meats, cheese, roasted birds, if they could be caught. Children squealed, old songs were sung. For a moment, the harsh world softened, but when the celebrations passed, the cheap meals returned. Simple, starchy, and dependable, not because people preferred them, but because they had to. These were the meals that kept them alive, that carried them through plagues and wars and winters. In the quiet of the night, as the fire dimmed to embers, the family curled beneath their shared blanket of wool and straw. Tomorrow, they would wake to the same toil, the same hunger, but they had eaten tonight. They had survived another day, and in the medieval world, that was enough. The damp wind curled through the crooked alleys of the old village, carrying with it the scent of wet thatch and boiled barley. In the hush of early morning, long before the first church bell stirred, a lean boy crouched beside the embers of a hearth, coaxing life back into the fire with a breath slow and careful. The coals glowed like tiny red eyes, reluctant to wake. Beside him sat a clay pot, not much in it, just a few limp leaks, a carrot turned soft, and the dregs of yesterday's barley mash. Still, for his family, it would be breakfast. This wasn't hunger as a passing feeling, this was a companion, constant and familiar, the kind that settled into the joints and blurred the eyes. Yet the people endured. Every morsel of food, no matter how humble, held stories of survival. Grains, pulses, roots. These were not choices but lifelines. In the outer fields, women bent over low fires, turning flat oatcakes on hot stones, the smell earthy and comforting. These cakes, made from ground oats mixed with a bit of water and salt, were the backbone of peasant meals. They were dry, a little bitter, but could sit on the shelf for days and still be edible, which was more than could be said for most things. Children carried their breakfast in linen scraps tied at the corners, a portable bundle of crust and cold pottage. They would eat in the fields, knees damp from morning dew, it blinking toward the gray sky. In villages where wheat was rare and costly, rye and barley did the work. Rye bread was common, coarse, dense, sometimes sour if the dough was left too long. It filled the belly, though, and that was what mattered. As the sun climbed, market sounds drifted in from neighboring towns, hawkers shouting, pigs squealing, the clatter of cartwheels on mud brick roads. But here in the countryside, trade was simpler. A few eggs exchanged for a knob of cheese, a clutch of onions for a small fish. The cheese, hard and pungent, was made months ago and aged in cellars that smelled of straw and stone. Even the poorest families tried to keep a bit of it, shaving slivers to melt into porridge or flavor broth. Nothing was wasted, not the ware, the rind, not even the cloudy water left after boiling beans. That water became soup. Thin, yes, but warm. In monasteries, the meals were quiet and plain. Lentils featured often, along with black bread and onions. For monks, simplicity was sacred. Their diet, though sparse, offered consistency that peasants often envied. A monk might know his next meal, while a farmer could not be sure if the hen would lay, or if the turnips would rot in the ground. Yet even here, in halls of prayer and candlelight, there was ingenuity. Herbs from garden plots transformed bland beans into something almost savory. Garlic was precious, salt, even more so, but when it could be spared, it made the meal feel whole. By evening, the village slowed again. Smoke curled up from chimneys as iron pots bubbled with the night's offering. Cabbage, most often, tough and stringy but softened with time and boiled till it lost its bite. Sometimes, lucky households had a bone, just a bone left over from market day or gifted by a generous neighbor. That bone would be boiled and boiled, water replenished over and over, its flavor leaching into thin soups. For days, families sat together by firelight, cupping their bowls with both hands, grateful even for broth. The stories passed down with each meal reminded them they had survived another day, and in this world, where famine was always one bad season away, that was no small victory. In the shadows of this daily struggle, the ingenuity of the medieval poor shone quietly. In foraged mushrooms, dried peas, and stale bread softened in warm milk, they found ways to live. Not grandly, not comfortably, but with a quiet defiance that no king could taste in his feast. And so they ate, day after day, not to enjoy, but to endure. Yet in that endurance, in every coarse crust and every slow-simmered pot, was the shape of something deep and lasting. The will to go on, even in the hungriest of times. They found a way to stay alive. It had been many months since the rains last fell with any strength. Crops that had once grown in thick rows now stood as brittle shadows of their former selves. the once verdant fields dulled to the color of dust. The village elders whispered about famine, though they did so in hushed tones, careful not to frighten the children. And yet, everyone could feel it, the change in the wind, the thinning of soups, the quiet desperation behind every bite of bread. In a small wooden house near the edge of the village, a woman named Elswith knelt beside her hearth, coaxing a weak flame beneath a pot of gruel. The scent was barely noticeable, mostly oats and water, with a few wild greens stirred in from the forest floor. Her son watched quietly from a straw-stuffed mat, too tired to speak, too used to hunger to complain. This wasn't the first night they'd eaten little, and it wouldn't be the last. The gruel hissed softly as it bubbled, the occasional snap of firewood offering the only sound in the room. Elswith had learned long ago how to make food stretch, how to boil bones a second, even third time, how to dry nettles in the sun, how to find mushrooms that wouldn't kill them. She knew which roots filled the belly and which merely teased it, which weeds numbed the tongue and which gave a faint, bitter kind of nourishment. Across the village, others did the same. Families leaned on old traditions and older instincts. There were no markets this time of year, no grain shipments, no traveling merchants, just what the earth offered, and what hands could coax from it. In the manor house, the Lord Steward had already begun measuring grain stocks. Even they, with their stores and cellars, were not immune to the creeping edge of scarcity. Children played less, their energy dulled by thinner meals. Mothers carried baskets not filled with bread or cheese, but with things foraged: acorns, wild garlic, blackberries. When in season, these were roasted, pounded into meal, or boiled until their flavor gave way to something edible. Some experimented with drying frog meat or grinding dried peas into powder for stew. Desperation made cooks of them all, and still, the community survived. Not because food was plentiful, but because they adapted, because they remembered. Old men taught boys how to set snares in the hedgerows, while old women passed down recipes that used almost nothing. Turnip peel soup, onion water broth, a mixture of barley husks and fat spread over coarse bread. These weren't meals. They were survival. One morning, before the sun had risen fully above the hills, a soft knock came at Elswith's door. She opened it to find her neighbor Rolf, standing with a bundle wrapped in cloth. His eyes were sunken, but his smile was warm. "Boiled beet tops," he said, lifting the bundle. "Traded a day's firewood for 'em. Thought you might like some." Elswith nodded and stepped aside. No one refused food. Not now. Not ever. She fetched 2 wooden bowls, and together they sat by the hearth, stirring the leaves into her thin broth. The flavor wasn't much, but the warmth was real, and for a while, they pretended it was enough. These small kindnesses were common now. The baker, who had once charged for every crumb, now gave away the burnt crusts at day's end. The shepherd allowed old women to skim a little milk from his goats. Even the blacksmith, who had little to offer beyond calloused hands, helped dig. A new root cellar for storing the turnips that hadn't yet rotted. A tea night, when the stars blinked through cold skies, stories were told to quiet the ache of empty bellies. Tales of saints and spirits, of kings who ate golden apples and rivers that ran with honey. Children fell asleep dreaming of banquets, of tables that never emptied, of meat that sizzled on iron pans. Their dreams were filled with smells they had never known, with tastes passed down only in stories. But some nights, they spoke of real food too, of the dishes they had once known in better years. Thick porridge with cream, rye bread soaked in meat drippings, stews with barley and onion, and just enough salted pork to make you weep. These memories were precious, and speaking them aloud was both comfort and torment. Winter deepened. The snow came soft and steady, blanketing the land in silence. Gathering food now meant digging through frozen earth, or cutting through ice to catch a fish too slow to flee. But even in this cold, meals were made from dried beans hoarded through autumn, from pickled roots, from a trickle of goat's milk that hadn't yet dried up. Once a week, a group of villagers would gather near the chapel to share what they could. One brought dried apples, another lentils, another a lump of lard saved from last season's slaughter. These were stirred into a single large pot, and everyone got a spoonful. It was called Poor Man's Feast, and though it fed more mouths than it filled, it reminded them they weren't alone. Ellsworth often brought nettle leaves or boiled bark shavings. Rolf once traded an old pair of boots for a handful of wheat berries, which he ground with a stone and shared as a thin paste. No one judged. Hunger had a way of making people kinder, quieter, more reverent. Each bite was a prayer, and each shared bowl a sermon of survival. But behind every gesture was the knowledge that not all would make it through. The old went first, their bodies too tired, too thin. Then the very young, unable to fight infection or fever. Graves were dug quickly and marked with stones, and meals continued in their absence. Through it all, the recipes persisted. They were passed from lips to ears, never written down, but remembered with care. You boiled the bones twice, then dried them for broth. You soaked dried peas overnight and mashed them with vinegar and onion. You dried cabbage leaves on the roof and crumbled them into soup. You roasted insects in ash when nothing else remained. In a strange way, the hunger preserved not just life, but culture. The meals of the poor, humble, meager, and forgotten by most, were the threads that tied one generation to the next. And though they were never praised in song or story, they mattered. They were the quiet proof that even in the hardest of times, people cooked, they gathered, they gave. And as the snow melted and spring crept back into the world, green shoots pushed through the soil again. Hope, too, began to rise like yeast in warm dough, slow but sure. The chill of early spring still clung to the narrow alleys of the village, where frost lingered in shadows and the breath of the townsfolk drifted in small clouds before their faces. It had been a long winter, not brutal, but biting enough to make every warm corner, every spoonful of porridge, feel like a treasure. By now, the stores of dried peas and lentils had thinned, and the root cellars, once full of turnips, parsnips, and carrots, had begun to look sparse. And so once again, as it had always been, the people returned to the rituals of gathering, foraging, stretching what little they had to fill the bellies of their kin. For Marjorie, a widow who had lived through many harsh seasons, the rhythm of scarcity had become second nature. She no longer mourned the lack of meat or fine flour. Those were luxuries meant for feast days or for the rich who rarely knew true hunger. Instead, she knew the value of barley water thickened with ground acorns, the quiet nourishment of nettle soup, the way she could roast onion skins and leek tops, with a bit of ash salt to flavor the pottage enough to fool the tongue. This wasn't a season for indulgence, it was survival, quiet and steady. Most mornings, she rose before the cocks did. Her small thatched cottage was on the edge of the village near the woods, and it allowed her first access to the early nettles and ground elder, before others thought to pluck them. Nettles stung the skin unless handled with care, but she knew the trick. A firm pinch near the base and a twist upward. Boiled, they lost their sting and turned soft and green, blending well with stale bread torn into broth. On this particular morning, as the fog drifted between the low beams of the tree line, Marjorie walked with her worn basket tucked into her elbow. There was a ritual in this, feeling the earth under her boots, sniffing the air to read the weather. She knew, just from the wind scent, that the mushrooms would not yet return. It was too early, but there would be sorrel, and with luck, a hen might have laid a surprise egg near the hedgerow. These were the little miracles of life: a fresh egg in March, a sprig of green with enough bite to wake the pallet dot in the village center. The baker's apprentice had begun to stir the ash-covered coals, coaxing yesterday's warmth into a new day's fire. The bread to be baked that day would be coarse and dark, full of chaff and oat hulls, what people mockingly called horse bread. But Marjorie knew better. When soaked in broth, even horse bread could feel hearty, even special. She passed the cooper's hut, where the man inside was already hammering at a cask rim, and then the blacksmith's forge, which was still silent. At this early hour, a dog barked once, and then fell quiet again, returning to its curled warmth against a stable wall. Everywhere, life moved slowly. It had to. Rushing spent energy, and energy meant food. In the mead hall shadow, old Will sat on a stool, watching the clouds roll in. He was always there at first light, chewing the same piece of bark, muttering about the old days when boars still roamed the forest and venison was not the Lord's exclusive right. No one listened anymore, but Marjorie nodded at him all the same. Respect didn't cost anything. She reached the edge of the woods and knelt, brushing aside last autumn's leaf litter. Beneath the mulch, delicate green sprigs pushed up, tender and young. Ground elder, the poor man's spinach. She plucked them gently and placed them in her basket, humming softly. Every handful would stretch a meal, add color to the otherwise brown stews. Nearby, she spotted chickweed and even a few dandelion leaves, bitter but full of strength. These would go into the noon pottage, boiled down with oats and a spoon of the dripping she had saved from the last pig rendering 6 weeks prior. Farther in, she found a patch of wild garlic, bright green spears pushing boldly toward the light. A treasure. Their scent filled her hands, earthy and sharp. With these, she could mask the flavor of rotted onions or stale beans. She smiled to herself. Some might find it sad, gathering weeds and roots, but to her, this was power, the power to feed herself without coin, without begging, without complaint. Back in her cottage, the hearth still held warmth from the night's embers. She fed it with twigs and dry moss, coaxing the flame to life, then placed a battered iron pot over it, filling it with water fetched from the stream before dawn. Into it went the greens, a handful of barley, a shriveled carrot, and a splash of vinegar she had made from sour ale. As it simmered, the room filled with scent, not rich or meaty, but green and alive. She dipped a wooden spoon in, tasted, and nodded. It was enough. And this was the reality for many like her. For every lord feasting on boar's head and spiced wine, there were 100 villagers boiling barley and chickweed, chewing on crusts, and sharing what little they had with neighbors. And in that simplicity, in that shared resilience, there was dignity. As the weeks turned to months, and the rhythm of medieval life continued its unhurried cycle, the people of the village leaned ever more into the seasons to dictate what they could harvest, preserve, and serve. This part of their world knew no supermarkets, no canned goods, and certainly no safety nets in times of crop failure. Every meal remained a quiet triumph over hunger and circumstance, shaped not by choice but necessity. The early morning light filtered through the patchy wooden shutters of a thatched cottage, painting soft golden streaks on the dirt floor. A woman stirred awake, her body wrapped in a woven woolen blanket that barely kept the chill away. Her name was Elswith, and like many peasant women of her time, her day would begin long before the sun had fully climbed into the sky. Her fingers, roughened from years of labor, reached for a wooden ladle resting by the hearth. The ashes from the previous night's fire were still faintly warm. With a practiced hand, she pushed aside the gray remains and uncovered a clay pot buried deep beneath. Inside was a thick, congealed mixture oat pottage, cooked the evening before and left to thicken overnight. It would be her family's first meal of the day. She scooped the contents into smaller bowls, adding a splash of cold water and stirring it over the fire until it bubbled again. Oats were a lifeline in these lands. Cheaper than wheat and heartier for the climate, they became the base for many meals. Not just for breakfast, they were transformed into gruels, thick stews, and even baked into rough flatbreads when the household was lucky enough to have access to a communal oven. Her husband, Wulfric, entered the small room with a slight limp, the legacy of a past winter's injury. He sat near the hearth, rubbing his hands together for warmth as the steam rose from the bowl Ellsworth placed in front of him. No meat sat in the pottage, nor even any milk, just oats, water, and a pinch of dried wild herbs she had gathered from the nearby hedgerows and summer. It was filling, but it was not luxurious. Still, it was enough. Later that morning, after tending to their modest plot of land, Wulfric joined other villagers in the fields. They worked for the local lord, as part of their feudal obligation, a few days each week of labor in exchange for the right to live on and farm the land. Lunch, if it came at all, was often shared between workers. Bread was the most common companion, hard, coarse loaves made from rye, barley, or a mix called maslin. It was rarely fresh, and often dipped in thin ale to soften it. Sometimes, if one was lucky, the bread might be smeared with dripping the fat left over from roasted meats, saved and treasured like gold. But that day, as they sat under a tree and passed around their meals, it was simply dry bread and a small onion, which Wulfric bit into slowly, savoring its sharpness. Back in the village, Ellsworth had joined other women near the shared oven, a large stone structure at the edge of the hamlet. Communal ovens were a blessing in a time where wood was precious, and individual hearths couldn't maintain the intense heat needed for baking. Each family took turns, bringing dough wrapped in cloth or leaves, marked with small notches to identify whose was whose. Her dough, risen slowly with wild yeast, and made from a coarse mix of grains, would bake into a dense, nutty loaf. She hoped it would last 3 days, long enough to keep their bellies from growling between pottage servings. While the bread baked, she prepared for supper. Supper, though the last meal of the day, wasn't much different from breakfast. Leftover pottage was again the main course, perhaps now thinned out more to stretch it. She added shreds of dried cabbage and a sliver of salted turnip, vegetables preserved carefully since the autumn. There was little variation, but small moments of flavor made all the difference. A sprinkle of ground mustard seeds, a few leaves of dried mint, or even a drop of honey when available, turned a monotonous bowl into something resembling a treat. Some evenings, when the weather allowed and spirits were high, families gathered together, not for a feast, but for warmth, storytelling, and the simple joy of shared company. Children would sit cross-legged on the packed dirt floors, nibbling on whatever root vegetables had been roasted in the hearth. Carrots and parsnips sweetened slightly by the fire were among the few treasures they could claim during winter. On special feast days, things changed. The church calendar dictated celebrations and fasts, and though fasting meant no meat and dairy, Feast days were something to look forward to. Villagers might pool resources for a larger stew. A chicken, if one could be spared, might be stewed with leeks and onions. Thickened with breadcrumbs or crushed grains, it became rich, hearty, and deeply satisfying. Children learned early to savor those days, to remember the taste of meat, even if only a few bites made it into their bowls. As spring approached, so too did a slight variety in the peasant diet. Wild greens emerged: nettles, sorrel, and garlic mustard, all gathered carefully by women and children. These were not just for flavor but vital sources of nutrients after a long winter of preserved foods. Elswith would blanch the greens, mix them into her pottage, or sometimes shape them into small fritters, fried in a spoonful of lard when available. Eggs, laid more frequently now by their few hens, could be added if they hadn't been set aside for barter. Trading was an essential part of survival. Honey, eggs, bundles of dried herbs, all were currency. In return, one might receive a wedge of cheese from a neighbor who kept goats, or a few small apples from another storehouse. The barter system kept bellies full when coin was scarce, and loyalty ran deeper than parchment laws. Despite the scarcity, food was never simply fuel. It was central to life, conversation, prayer, and even punishment. To go without, truly without, was a terrifying prospect. Crop failures meant not only empty bowls, but empty cradles, quiet fields, and hollow eyes. So every bite was sacred, and every scrap preserved. Bones were boiled thrice. Bread crusts were dried and reused as trenchers. Ale dregs were poured into soup. Nothing, not even a handful of spoiled berries, was wasted without a second thought. On long summer evenings, when work ran late, but the air stayed warm, people dined outdoors. A bowl of beans stewed with garlic, chives, or a porridge flavored with dried apple slices might be shared among neighbors. Dogs scurried beneath benches, children played nearby, and the scent of smoke drifted gently through the twilight. It was a quiet life, punctuated by hunger, but grounded in resilience. To survive medieval poverty was to master the art of making do, of transforming the humblest ingredients into sustaining meals, of understanding the land, its rhythm, its mercy, and sometimes its indifference. And though the meals may not have impressed royalty, they told stories of mothers and fathers scraping bowls for the last bit, of children laughing with greasy fingers after a rare treat, of families who, with so little, somehow, still had enough. The sun was still a faint glow beneath the eastern horizon when the smell of porridge began to drift through the tiny thatched cottages of the village. The air was damp with dew, the grass underfoot heavy with moisture, and the sound of roosters crowing echoed across the stone walls and wooden fences that surrounded each modest home. Inside one of these homes, a woman named Aldith stirred a pot over the hearth, the soft bubbling of barley gruel blending with the crackle of the fire. This was breakfast, a simple, watery porridge made from coarse barley, with perhaps a pinch of salt, if the household had any to spare. For Aldith, and for countless others like her, this meal was not merely tradition, it was survival. By the 14th century, the peasant diet had evolved very little from earlier centuries. It was humble, repetitive, and heavily dependent on the seasons. In spring and summer, villagers might have a bit more variety in their meals. Wild greens, like nettles, dandelion leaves, and sorrel would be gathered and boiled into soups, or mixed with grains to stretch the meager portions. In late summer, beans and peas became staples. These were dried carefully and stored for the leaner months to come. Bread, when available, was coarse and dark, made from rye, barley, or even ground peas and beans. During years of poor harvest, white bread, made from refined wheat, was a luxury for the nobility. Most villagers had never even tasted it. Aldith's children, thin and barefoot, sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor, their wooden bowls in hand, waiting for her to ladle the porridge. It was thin today. The stores of barley were running low, and the harvest was still weeks away. She said nothing as she served them. Words were unnecessary. This was their life, the way it had always been. They ate in silence, broken only by the occasional slurp or the sound of spoons scraping wood. After breakfast, the day began in earnest. Her husband, Wulfric, hoisted a dull hoe over his shoulder and headed to the fields. The work was relentless, the hours long. Lunch would be brought out to him, a piece of hard rye bread, and maybe a bit of dried pea mash wrapped in a cloth. If they were lucky, there might be a bit of cheese. But cheese was rare. It required milk, and milk came from cows, and cows were a luxury few peasants could maintain. In the evenings, supper was again porridge or pottage, a thick stew of grains, legumes, and wild vegetables. Occasionally, a bit of fatty bacon or dried fish might be added for flavor, but meat was reserved for feast days and special occasions. Most peasants could go weeks, even months, without eating any meat. Instead, they relied on flavorings like onions, garlic, leeks, and herbs gathered from hedgerows to keep the monotony of their meals at bay. What truly kept them alive was their resilience, the ability to adapt. During hard years when crops failed and stores ran low, they turned to substitutes. Acorns, after being carefully leached of their bitterness, could be ground into flour. Bark from certain trees was used to thicken soups. Even rats or hedgehogs might end up in the pot, skinned, cleaned, and boiled into something barely palatable. Hunger taught them creativity. Children learned early how to forage. They combed forests and meadows for mushrooms, berries, and nuts. Elderly women passed down knowledge of what was safe and what was deadly. A mistake could cost a life, but those who listened learned the secrets of the land. Goosegrass could be boiled. Wild garlic could be added to stews. Fungi like puffballs and chanterelles, when found, were treasured additions. Monasteries and manor houses, while often distant from the daily struggles of peasantry, played a role in shaping the foodscape. Lords sometimes provided grain during times of scarcity, though this was more an act of preservation than charity. After all, dead peasants couldn't work, and monasteries, in their piety, might distribute bread or ale to the poor. On special saint days, a village might feast together bowls of thick broth, bread dipped in dripping, perhaps even a roast shared among many. It was on these days that the memory of hunger was momentarily forgotten. Back in Aldith's cottage, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the shadows of dusk crept in, she began preparing the evening meal. Her hands worked methodically. She added dried peas to a pot, chopped a small onion, and sprinkled in salt. From a pouch, she pulled a bit of dried marjoram and thyme she had hung near the hearth months ago. The smell was comforting, familiar, a reminder that even in a life defined by scarcity, there could still be flavor, still be warmth. As the stew simmered, the children gathered around, their faces lit by firelight. Aldith thought of the stories her mother had told, of winters so harsh that bark soup was all they had, of summers when the river dried up and the crops failed. They had survived then, and they would survive now, because food, no matter how meager, was not just sustenance, it was hope. And in every spoonful of barley gruel, every bitter green boiled into pottage, every hard crust of bread softened in broth, there was the quiet strength of those who refused to be broken. The poor did not eat to thrive. They ate to endure, to hold on until morning, to keep going, one meal at a time. The embers of the village hearth flickered quietly as the wind howled across the empty fields beyond the cottages, and in that chill air, families huddled closely around their only source of warmth. By now, the routines of survival had become etched into every motion, every glance, and every spoonful of gruel that passed between trembling lips. This late into the season, the land had long since given up its final gifts of grain and root, and the storerooms were nearly hollow echoes of the bounty they once held. But even in the leanest days of winter, people found a way to persist. In many corners of the village, dried legumes became the basis of almost every meal. Simple lentil stews simmered slowly throughout the day, absorbing whatever flavor could be coaxed from herbs, onions, or perhaps the last piece of dried pork fat clinging to the bottom of a hanging string. No one expected luxury, only warmth, and enough to keep the children's bellies from aching. For those who could barter or had saved scraps of silver, tiny sacks of barley could still be bought from distant travelers or tradesmen passing through, and a thick barley mash made for a supper both filling and familiar. The church, solemn and ever-present, sometimes distributed portions of bread to the poorest. But even the bread had changed in this season, coarser, darker, denser, made often with pea flour, ground acorns, or even remnants of ground-up bark when grain ran short. It was hard on the teeth and heavier on the stomach, but it filled the void. The monks, when they had more to share, might offer thin ale and cheese, rinds to the old, the sick, or the mothers of infants. In those moments, eyes lit up, not for the taste, but for the kindness. Sometimes, on rare evenings, when luck tilted in their favor, villagers returned from the forest with mushrooms, chestnuts, or a snared rabbit. These were cause for quiet celebration. A shared stew pot would go over the fire, and the scent alone would bring neighbors knocking gently at the door, asking only to share in a spoonful or two. It was understood that on another night, it might be you knocking. Children learned early how to forage. They knew the look of edible greens that clung low to the ground, how to dig carefully for wild parsnips, or how to spot nuts before the squirrels did. Their laughter in the woods was less about play and more about survival. The older ones whispered stories of people who had survived winters on nothing but boiled nettles and bitter herbs. They whispered not to frighten, but to teach. This was how things had been, and how they still might be. Meal preparation was not a task, but a sacred act. Women stirred pots with the same care they might swaddle a newborn. Every crust of bread saved, every bone boiled twice over, every speck of flour stretched to its limits, was a defiance of the hunger that loomed just outside the door. Men who worked in the fields often returned home without having eaten all day, their hunger swallowed behind stoic silence. Their reward was not a feast, but the comfort of sitting by the fire, of watching steam rise from a clay bowl. As days dragged slowly toward spring, hunger grew into a familiar companion, but so did resilience. Families who had weathered many winters before knew the rhythm, the thinning meals, the longer prayers, the hopeful glances at the sky each morning. Occasionally, a traveler would arrive with news of a distant village faring better, of a monastery that still had grain stores, of a spring that had come early somewhere far away. These stories were nourishment, too. In the midst of scarcity, there remained small indulgences. A bit of honey hoarded from summer harvests, used only on birthdays or holy days. A wedge of sharp cheese from a neighbor who'd had a lucky year. Spices, almost unheard of, might be smuggled in by merchants and sold in pinches to those with coin. But even a sprinkle of wild garlic or salt could lift a meal above mere sustenance and turn it into a moment of joy. The quiet resilience of these people was not born of choice, but of necessity. No one romanticized their meals, but neither did they despair them. They knew hunger by name, but they also knew community. They knew that survival was shared, and that even the humblest meal passed between cracked hands under a smoky thatched roof was a triumph. And when, at last, the ground softened and green returned to the world, they would rise with the season. Their meals would grow richer once more, not because the land had changed, but because they had endured.